Good afternoon. Buenas tardes. Thank you for joining us today. On behalf of Mitchell Kaplan, the Miami Book Fair, and everyone at Books and Books, I'm thrilled to welcome you to this afternoon's virtual event with Susan Minot to discuss her new compilation of short stories, Why I Don't Write, published by Knopf. Susan Minot is an award-winning novelist, short story writer, poet, and screenwriter. She studied writing and painting at Brown University and received an MFA in writing from Columbia University. Her first novel, Monkeys, was published in a dozen countries and won the Prix Femina Étranger in France in 1987. The novel was followed by Lust and Other Stories, a collection about wayward artists and journalists living in New York City. She's always been interested in cinema as a student and moviegoer. Her novel, Evening, was a worldwide bestseller and became a major motion picture in 2007. The film Stealing Beauty was a collaboration with the director Bernardo Bertolucci. Why I Don't Write is her first short fiction collection in 30 years. It spans across many landscapes to deliver cutting narratives of desire, trauma, and loss in her characters' interior lives. NPR noted, this collection demonstrates Minot's skill in telling women's stories, and in particular, and showing with vivid clarity how we all crave meaning and connection. Joining us in conversation with Susan today is Francesca Marciano, an Italian screenwriter, novelist, and actress. She's the author of the novels Rules of the Wild, Casa Rosa, and The End of Manners, and the story collections The Other Language, and her newest, Animal Spirit, which Jhumpa Lahiri calls astonishing. She joins us this afternoon from Puglia in Italy, where it's already late at night. Throughout tonight's broadcast, we invite you to ask questions by pressing the Ask a Question button at the bottom of the screen. And you can find Why I Don't Write, Animal Spirit, and any other book you might need for purchase at Books and Books below by clicking the green button. Every purchase you make helps support Books and Books, so we thank you. And now, without further ado, I'd like to bring both of our guests to the screen. Here we go.
Hello. Hi, Susan.
Hello, my dear. Sorry, I'm sorry to make you miss your party there in Puglia.
It was a dinner, but I got food and a glass of wine, so I'm fine. 10 o'clock at night here.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, so good to see you, Susan. And I can't tell you, but I actually will tell you how much I love this book. And I told you when I just read it, I'm incredibly jealous of the title and the jacket, which I think every writer should make a poster out of it. And so it's just fantastic. There it is. So anyway, this is your collection of short stories after what, 30 years?
Well, they were written over 30 years. So yeah, there are 5 or 6 of them are more recent, but some I wrote back in the 90s. Yeah. And that
so
was 30 years ago for now.
In a drawer for so long.
Well, they actually were published then, but they were never collected because my last collection was in 1989.
Right. In fact, the collection starts with a story set in Kenya, Pole Pole, which means slowly, slowly in Swahili, and also sorry. It has both meanings. And I say that because, full disclosure, Susan and I met many years ago in Rome, but then at the time I was living in Kenya and you came to visit. And it was, I think, your first time in Kenya. And I think Africa...
I will say you were my introduction to Kenya, where I ended up falling in love on many different levels and spending a lot of time there. And yeah, absolutely.
And somehow it reappeared many times in your work. Africa, and especially in 30 Girls, of course. So I was just curious, did you write this first story after one of your first trips to Kenya, or was it something you wrote afterwards?
It was something I wrote after 30 Girls, in fact.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And I mean, a lot of the stories in this book, my last collection of stories, which was called Lust and Other Stories, was, very much thematic about young men and women, or more like boys and girls in their 20s and 30s, sort of trying to make a connection, and mostly in urban settings. And it's divided into sections. In the first section, there's stories about the beginning of love, and the middle of love, and then the end of love. So I had really organized it like an album, a thematic album. And these stories I was writing, like we were saying, over 30 years. And I've been working since 30 Girls. I've been working on what I thought was going to be a little novella, just something to dash off. You think of it as short. And it's gotten longer, and it's going to be a more longer novel. But in the frustration, and that's been 5 years now, of not sort of finishing something and feeling like so I started writing sort of stories on the side. And this African story, I've also thought of like a number of other African stories that could be collected in something. So this was sort of a gesture in that direction. Another story in the collection called Occupied is actually a take out, or an outtake of the novel I'm working on. So that's a little sneak peek of the novel.
Oh, great.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, this collection has sort of doesn't really have a unifying theme, but it does in a way, because I think you've always talked about love, but you've talked about desire. You write so well about longing. You write so well about nostalgia, or the lack of love, or the emptiness that it, leaves your characters with when that sort of, I think you're one of the few writers who can really describe those feelings in a way that is sort of almost physical, the physicality of how the touch, it's very sensual, it's very also erotic, even when nothing is happening. And this is an encounter between a woman and a man that she meets one night in a dinner party in Nairobi. And there's one line that I thought was absolutely brilliant when the two of them decide to leave together, and it turns out it's going to be a sort of a one-night stand type thing. And the guy's very kind of macho and tries to look very, he knows he's interesting and he's attractive. And at one point he asks her, so what are you really doing here? What are you doing here? And she says, well, I'm doing a documentary. And she says, nah, what are you really doing? And then, he's such a bully, really. And then she says, I hope you're not, are you going to be one of those people who gives you a hard time for being in Africa? And I just thought this was such a great line, and that gives such a spin to that short story and the relationship between the two and the battle that ensues. And also so I just wanted to hear what you thought about that, and why did you put that line?
It's I will say, just since the book has just come out, it's always particularly interesting, particularly when something's been there and no one seemed to have looked at it for 30 years, to hear the things that strike people. And I can see why that strikes you, because you too have written about Africa. And I'm just going to, we decided we weren't going to do this back and forth, but I am going to show you Francesca's book, which is also out now. And there are beautiful short stories in here. she has a previous collection which has a number of stories set in Africa. Anyway, we're not going to keep on doing that, but I just had to say. There's a, a lot of these stories are about characters who are sort of lunging toward experience. And to be in a place that you're not familiar with is one way to kind of experience yourself in a new way. So I think that's that was the part of the reason for that. And it's interesting because sometimes people who are defensive about their country will be sort of attacking, hostile about someone coming to visit there. Like, oh, you're going to use this in a way, you're not going to understand it. And I remember sort of hearing that a lot when I was in Africa, because you'll never know what really goes on here. And I'm sure that's true, but a traveler's experience in a country that he or she doesn't know is an important experience. You know, it's an important kind of exploration. And but I was going to read, we're going to stipple throughout this conversation a few little bits from the book so you can see the kind of variety. And I was going to read one. You've given a good introduction to Pole Pole, so I can say that this is part of the story. Is Daisy is the name of our documentary filmmaker, and it's the next morning, and she's found out in the course of this, one night stand that this dashing journalist is married, and he's like, "Oh, well, you didn't know that," and she's like, "Well, no, you didn't tell me," but then she's also, "But I didn't really ask," and so it's sort of. So suddenly this lovely feeling she's had of this sort of erotic night becomes a little less good feeling. Yeah. So this is her the next day. There is, this man has, as he calls it, his staff, who live in a house kind of next door. And she's met one woman named Cecily, who's seems to be sort of no-nonsense woman hanging up the clothes and sizing up the man, and here sizing up her a little bit. Daisy stood next to the Jeep in the driveway. Through the front window of the cottage, she could see the man on the telephone with his back to her, facing the wall, talking to the wife, she figured. It was bright outside and she was without sunglasses. She strolled off to be out of sight of the man, scuffing the ground. Many footprints had distressed the dirt. Suddenly, she felt exhausted. For a moment, she was back in bed with the man who was holding her wrist. She felt swept up again, and it ran through her body. Sex was like that. Not all of you came back right away. Part of you lingered with the person, not unhappily. It was nice to be relieved of yourself, though eventually that part would return. She had moved into the shade near Edmund's house. The one door was open to a turquoise-painted wall. There was thin grass in the front yard and a small circle of charred wood. Against the ochre wash of the house sat two white molded plastic chairs. A small child appeared in the doorway, wearing a pink sleeveless dress with ruffles at the shoulders and eating a papaya. She eyed Daisy. Daisy smiled and said, "Habari." The girl's eyes widened, and she looked behind her for instruction, then stared again at Daisy. Cecily appeared behind the little girl, carrying something, shooing her out of the door. Her arms were straining under the weight of a large gray tub. The little girl sat on the log near the burnt area, biting the papaya, still watching Daisy. Cecily hauled the tub to the end of the yard near some scarlet hibiscus and tossed the water out. It floated in the air like a mirror, then came down flat and made a circle of puff in the dirt. Cecily turned around and looked at her, a white woman standing on the tan drive in her tan skirt. Daisy waved and smiled and started to step back. She rocked on her sandals. Cecily came forward a few steps and stopped. Her smooth, solid face was not smiling. At first, Daisy thought she was getting some version of the cold stare, the look of disapproval any girl might get stumbling out of the man's cottage, possibly one in a series of aimless white girls. But when Cecily lifted her hand to shield her eyes from the sun, Daisy saw a different expression. She was looking at Daisy with pity.
Well, it's a beautiful story. And what struck me about the collection is that the variety, of styles that you've used. And some stories take off in a completely different direction. For instance, Café Mort is a very different style and abstract. Usually your books are very realistic. You're so good at describing, I always think you're able to take something and take it apart in like tiny little parts and analyze them one by one so that one gets the feeling in a such exact manner, which is sort of uncanny almost. And so you do so very well with describing emotions and relationships between people and what goes on, sort of the subtext. Suddenly we're in Café Mort, which is a strange cafe where the clients are all people that have died, and the girls who behind the counter and serve food and coffee can only qualify if, as workers there, if they've lost someone. Am I correct? So how did you?
Not only that they've lost someone, but they're grieving for someone.
They must be grieving, exactly.
So attached to.
And even the food that they serve dishes like scrambled clouds, September odes, morphine supremes. Now that is funny. And tell me, how did you come up with the story? And
so that story I wrote probably 20 years ago. I used to waitress when I first came to New York City. And, there are a lot of waitress stories. So I had sort of left that terrain until I could think of a new way to approach it. And I remember it wasn't a restaurant I particularly liked. It was kind of on the Upper East Side, and I didn't really relate to any of the clientele, or I got along with the people I was working with, but they were in kind of a different world. And then I thought about, you think many different things when a story starts, but I thought it was just so like deathly in there. And then I thought, with some sort of metaphors like that, you think, oh, well, what if you just made that the truth? And then I thought, okay, if you made that the truth and everyone's dead, like that wasn't enough of a conceit. You'd have to think, so are the people waiting on them dead? And then I thought, no, the people are waiting on them are the people that can't get over someone. So it ended up being more about a story about grief.
Yes, it is.
People's different grief, and also, I'm fascinated, if desire is one of the things I keep on writing about. I also seem to keep on writing about death and loss. And then the third one along the line is memory and time.
Yeah.
So I think these three things, they can all sort of tributary out into pretty much everything.
Did you find out that I'm just curious because I think that we all write, there's a point in a writer's life and the writer realizes that he or she's been writing over and over about the same thing. And when did you find out that you were doing that?
By sort of, book 3 or 4. Because they, you just have the same, it's your personality kind of, it keeps going toward, you may try to manage it in a different way, but those seem to be, those are both not only troubling things, but endlessly fascinating things.
Yeah, they're like a magnet that you keeps going back to.
But
And
one has to both make sense of it, or there are so many incredible kind of stories around those three subjects.
in fact, in Occupy, which I believe is a probably more recent,
That's the one that's out of the novel.
Yeah.
You know.
Yes.
Which is set inside of the 90s into the.
Well, the protagonist, well, I forget her name now.
Ivy.
Ivy.
Yeah, Ivy, which at this point is the working title of the book.
Okay, so Ivy is on a bicycle, and she is going through a part of Manhattan where it's Occupy Wall Street, right? Where there's quite a lot of characters.
The Cody Park.
Which you're so funny when you describe these people. I'm just reading a fellow in black retro glasses was typing on a computer which rested on a large cardboard box from a washing machine, decorated all over with black X's and one large O, presumably for Occupy, with a smiley face inside. A sign nearby said, "Enough is enough." That, she thought, admiring its wide net, could be applied to everything. Anyway, this girl is actually wondering whether does she have a political faith, that she has a scope or a goal like these people that seem to really know what they want and what they're ready to fight for, whereas she feels that her mind is actually occupied mostly in that moment by this man who she's been having a flirt with, and that is basically kind of maybe vanished or is just not calling her back.
Elusively, yeah.
Yeah, very elusively. So I have to admit that I was late in getting the joke, if you will allow me to say it. That, she has an occupied mind, in fact, by this big thought. And it's a very, it's a wonderful story because the juxtaposition of these two realities, of people that are there, is so convinced that they have something to fight for, and the suppression of a thought that never abandons her, and that then something happens, of course, in the story that flips it all around. It's really quite clever the way you've constructed it.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to read something?
Yeah, I was just going to read a little bit of her. So she's there because she's interested. She's interested to see what's going on here. And at another time in her life, she probably would have been involved. She does have sort of a past of activism.
Yes.
But now she's got an 8-year-old son waiting at home. She's a single mom for the babysitter needs to be relieved at 5. So she's on her way home. She's an artist and she's coming back from her studio. So she's got a lot of things to occupy her. She talks about also her concern with her husband. With her son, and her marriage broke up. Someone who read this story, and I didn't intend this, she does reflect on, because it's down in the same area where 9/11 was, and Ivy had witnessed one of the buildings going down, not from downtown, but from further uptown. So she can't help but think of that, even though this is 9 years later that she's visiting, and the hole there. And then at one point, I sort of described metaphorically how the breakup of her marriage and taking her son away from the father was like this big crater.
Yes.
I didn't mean to, even like attach anything metaphorically to 9/11 because it's like untouchable. You know what I mean? Anyway, I'll read like a little bit about, she's talking about like walking through, or actually maybe I'll read about a reflection about the seeing 9/11. She's remembering that. She is walking near Washington Square Park, which is about a mile away. The vision had been very like a hallucination. You could not believe what you were seeing. That was the phrase everyone kept using. They couldn't believe what they had seen. Her brain immediately registered the otherworldliness of the seconds. The image entered, and she was aware that in that instant that it would never leave her. Out of the thousands of images which the city gathered and posted and printed and beamed around the world after that morning, none she saw had been from the precise place where she stood, watching as her knees buckled, dropping as the building dropped. That was one time when what was in front of her was greater in intensity than what she saw depicted after. Not like the park in front of her now, which looked more puny than it did in the pictures. On that Tuesday morning, she felt that, as a witness, she was a kind of custodian of the depths. It sounded self-aggrandizing, so she never admitted the feeling, but she had taken it inside her, the obligation. But really, what kind of custodian could one be of such a thing, and what could one do with it? The sun was no longer visible, having dropped behind the buildings, so the sky would be light for another hour. She wondered now, as she paced down the sidewalk slope, how many people had actually witnessed it, the murder of thousands of people, and how many others kept that vision inside them and felt, as she did, to be a guardian of it.
Thank you. So beautiful. I'm curious you said this is going to be a novella you're still working on, or is it done?
It was going to be a novella. I like to start small, and then you have that tiny focus, and then you sort of can build out if there seems to be material that holds it, instead of thinking some vast idea and then having to fill it in, right? There's actually one story in the book called The Torch, which is about, it's just 4 pages, and it's about a woman on her deathbed who basically calls out for a man other than her husband, who's sitting there with her. You don't really realize that's what's going on. That actually I wrote before Evening.
Yeah, because that reminded me of Evening.
It's like a 4-page version. Then I started to think, what's going on inside that woman's mind? And that's what Evening became. It's what's going on in the mind of this woman who's lying on her deathbed, calling out for a man other than her husband.
Yeah. So there you go. So my question was, when you were working on the what will be Ivy, the novel, were you at the same time also writing some of these stories? I mean, were you be able to work on both?
Yes, I wrote Pole Pole when I was writing that. I wrote Boston Common at Twilight. I wrote about 5 of the stories. I wrote Why I Don't Write. And then Occupied, I thought, well, why don't I take what would be sort of a chapter in the novel and just turn it into a short story so that I can finish something, so there can be something that can go out. So it's got a little more background in it than it will read in the book. The man that she's sort of occupied with is a completely different character in the novel, but it was just, I thought, let's just get something out there.
Were you writing exactly like in the morning, the short story, and in the afternoon the novel?
No. You sort of leave the novel for a while. Yeah.
I remember when you were, I think, working on 30 Girls, I think it was, and I was in New York, and I remember you showing me, you had on your table all these bits of paper, handwritten, and then scotch them together. It was like an installation. I've always thought it was amazing the way you work. Are you still working like
Yeah,
that?
I don't work linearly. You know, I have a, right now I have a
linear.
what's that?
So definitely what I saw on your kitchen table did not look linear in any way.
You gotta make it linear because it does, after all, have to be one page after another, right? But I can, you know, start writing sometimes, you know, when you're writing something and you're being made to write that next part, like the scene that has to happen tomorrow. I have, there's something just in my nature that balks against
you rebel
to do something. Yes. So I rebel against myself. And I think, well, I'm going to go and write a different part of the book now. Or I'm going to abandon you altogether and write a short story because that's not what I'm supposed to be doing. And for some reason, writing something that's not the thing you're, who's supposed to, according to no one but myself, you know, but it gives it a kind of secret sort of atmosphere to it. And then it's a little more, I don't know, your own somehow. Like when it starts to be the thing you're committed to, and then you're going to have to write this part, right away that pressure of what it's supposed to be like, you know, starts happening, and it's harder to find your voice. Yeah.
Yes. So let's talk about why I don't write. Which is like a very sort of freestyle, fabulous, pause in the book.
Right. Well, I'll read a piece, and then you can get an idea of what I was, again, the idea came from this, is I keep a lot of journals, and I used to even linearly keep, you know, journal number 140 and then number 141 or whatever. But now I keep about 5 at the same time, thinking that's sort of for those things, that's for this. Like, here's a secret journal that I'm not supposed to be. So I'm constantly writing down lines. I'm writing down things I hear. It's a way of taking me out of my head to sort of record what I hear other people saying or other things that I read. And I have found, you know, how long we have phones for, like full-fledged computers and phones for about 15 years now, maybe more, you know, and the places that you can get sucked into and the things that you can run across means that there's like way more this is sort of a bad analogy because they're natural and this is sort of unnatural, but it's like a lot of dandelion seeds like flying through the air all the time. And you know, I run planes, so I stop. I went down a rabbit hole and I was looking at something. But in order to write, you really do need to focus and concentrate. And before the internet, there was plenty to worry about. You were thinking about your children, or you're worrying about the bills, but now with this, we've got a whole extra dimension of odd coming off
distractions.
Yes. But there are things that sort of are enough to they'll distract you to think, oh, that's kind of interesting. I might want to follow that thought. Or they're disturbing things, you know, and you get disturbed and you think, why write? Like, really, you know, with this happening somewhere else, I'm supposed to care what I put down on my right. So here's just a little, some people have called this a poem, because it's really just a series of impressionistic things, the things that keep you from writing. And they're not always bad. They can be good too. There's a little section. All day, you ask yourself, what are you doing all day? 53 dead, not including the shooter. When you take the plant out of the plastic container, pull the thin roots to dangle down and place into the hole. Give it water. Tunnel, no light at the end of 1 hour, then another. The title of the song, Crawl to Me, Baby, Crawl to Me. Are you going to the march? As soon as you gave them a donation, they bombarded you with continual requests for more. They heard back from the doctor. It was not good news. Your balance total is... That's not what the fire marshal said. I walk around the city and listen to people as I pass them on the sidewalks. Usually they are talking on their phones. Often they are not looking at where they are going. They are looking into their palms. You're in the wrong line. Your line is over there. The sweet air in the morning, warmed by the sun. Headache, hunger, the thumping far below the floor. Death estimates ran from 150 to 500, but could not be confirmed. You write if you have to.
You know, I was reading it. It's what, 4 pages long? They're also
it's long.
Is it?
It goes on and on.
No, I know it goes on and on, but I don't remember how many pages it is. But it felt like it's a writer's life compressed in a few pages. But then I thought, no, it's not a writer's life. It's everyone's life.
That's right. No, it's 15 pages. Like
15 pages of these like tiny, fragments bombarding our head constantly.
It could be called insomnia.
Yeah, but also it's the rhythm of life, bad news, good news, light news, heavy news, or just think, your line is, it just feels like this is catching the murmur of the world, around us. So, and it is a poem, I think. It just feels like a poem. And it's such a brilliant title for the book.
Well, I was also thinking when I gave it that title. So I had these things drifting around, and writers are often asked to write, and I teach writing, so I often give these essays to my students because they're usually quite articulate and, saying why I write, because that's something a writer gets asked. And I thought, well, then there's the why I don't write.
Which is, I think, a question shared by many.
It is, but the not to give away the end of the story, hopefully people will forget it, but at the end she gets to, all these things, and she says, as if why I don't write, another story will come, and then see above. Yeah. So these are the things we write about. We write about not being able to write. We write about all the things that drift through our brains.
There is, I have to say that one of my favorite stories, because I thought it was particularly strong, and for many reasons, and I was happy you put it as the last, because it's such a strong story. It's the
last story that it's the one I most recently wrote.
Really?
Yeah, that's why it's at the end. So again, someone else pointed out that the character in it is Sophie Vincent. She's in college, and that's one of the characters in Monkeys. So, and I didn't plan this. Again, someone pointed this out. The first story is set in Kenya, which is where I left off my last book. And then the last story refers to a character, a kind of outtake again. It's not like the character, 10 years ahead of time. It's actually during the period of Monkeys. It's after the mother has died. And this is just a scene, a story we didn't know was happening to Sophie.
It's such a good story, Susan. By the way, I had to, I'm in Puglia, there's no bookstores that sell it.
Oh, no, I know.
But I read She, which is Monkeys in Italian. I just reread it the other day. What a powerful book. And if any of you haven't read it, you just run tomorrow, and die monkeys.
Chimie in Italy, monkeys in America.
Anyway, it's such a powerful story. I didn't, so it was intentional, of course, to call her Sophie Vincent.
Well, I was writing this story and I thought this could easily be a character that I've written already. Do I want to make a different character very much like her, or just use her? So I used her.
Well, anyways, do you want to talk about this story a little bit, or if you want to read something?
Well, I'll read one thing from it. It's kind of a, one could say it's a bit of a Me Too story, because
it is. It's a totally Me Too story.
It's about Sophie Vincent she's a senior in college. Her mother has recently. What's that?
We're in the 80s.
We're in 78, 1978. And she's about to graduate. Her mother has been killed in an accident sort of 3 or 4 months before. So she's kind of walking in a daze. But she's studying writing, and she has a professor who everyone, sort of agrees is kind of a creep, but she's inspired by him. And she ends up taking like a graduate writing class with him, and at one point, I won't sort of describe too much, but he does something very sort of sleazy and shocking to her. Just not that she hasn't expected it, but she didn't think he was going to be that pathetic, really. So in this story, because it's being written about something so long ago, I thought, well, that's, part of our experience of things is, looking back on something. So we're not in the moment. We're talking about how much she remembers in the way that you remember things. Anyway, this is a paragraph sort of about memory, and then we can talk a little bit more. So she's been in a car with him, and he says something. Well, it's where the title comes from. He just turns to her and says, "Let's speak in a language any cat or dog could understand," which is almost comical, but it's
creepy.
It's just so creepy and so awful, and she isn't expecting it, and so she never forgot it. She never forgot that it happened. It didn't traumatize her sort of forever, but she continually would go back and think about it. She would even tell it as a story to people, because sometimes these, without terrible ramifications, these stories are interesting, and even people would laugh at it. And so this is just about the experience of going back upon our experience. You think you are done with an experience once it is over, and it is set into some version in the stories, and there it will sit. But if you return to the experience many years later, because you are, say, urged by a movement in the culture to re-examine the treatment of women, an examination which seems to come every 50 years or so before it fades away again, then you might discover new details waiting for you unnoticed. What you do not know when you are young is that you may, as your life goes on, return to things that happened, and that the more you visit a thing, the more time you spend experiencing it in reflection, in memory. So that an event which took, say, an hour in your life may afterward be recalled and visited by you 50 times over. Each time you remember it. Moments of happiness, such as the period one fell in love, may be remembered again and again, weeks worth if it was really compelling thing to think about. And moments when one was shocked might be similarly preserved, not voluntarily, and exist as a freeze frame.
Wow. What prompted you to write it after so many years?
Well, it says it in that paragraph. It's like because of the Me Too movement, you think
Was it Me Too? I mean, let me phrase it. At what point of the Me Too movement did you?
Well, it was a story I always thought about putting down. Okay, and then with the Me Too movement, seeing many different, I'll say either chronicles or stories or diatribes or many of the ways that women were and men sometimes expressing times when they were sort of blindsided and messed with because they were sort of either powerful or stronger male was preying on them in some way. Or so I thought, and so I was writing the story, I thought I'd like to write that happening because that's interesting. And it's a story that, it's amazing how many men I heard during the Me Too stories coming out saying, I had no idea that this was going on. I mean, so you think this story needs to be told. Part of the movement is that there's so much nuance involved in someone demeaning you by a statement, and that's one end of the spectrum, and actually accosting you sexually on the other, which is the most extreme version of attack. So I thought I'd examine this particular thing where not the worst thing happened, because then that would overweigh sort of looking at the different elements in it, and have the person not just be this, a character where this thing just happens, but having other things going on in her life. So she sort of takes it in this way, but not so much, or at that moment takes it a particular way. And just as a way of looking at all the facets around experiences like this, which even if they share the same, female, oh my God, I've just been, hit with another kind of one of these comments or another moment like this, they're still all individual. So I wanted to just examine it that way.
Mm-hmm. I think what's incredibly brilliant in the story is that you start out with, her, the teacher, the professor, the lessons. You realize that he's being a little creepy and embarrassing, and then he does something that is upsetting her, but nothing terrible happens. But then boom, at some point halfway through the story, you throw this grenade into it by saying just a few weeks or months before her mother had been killed in an accident, and you go, wow, this is the state of mind she's in. This is how vulnerable she is, and he doesn't even, realize that.
Well,
maybe he actually
is that he does.
He does.
Still messes with her,
He's such a narcissist that he's just like thinks that, she's probably gotten over it already because of whatever. But anyway, it's brilliant the way you read it and it sort of explodes. That paragraph puts the whole situation into a completely different perspective. And you go, my God, poor girl, there she is dealing with this incredible grief and trying to stay focused in his, in his classes. And she really wants to be a writer, but she's struggling to stay alive after this incredible blow. Mm-hmm. And also, the fact that I just reread Monkeys and kind of brought me back to, and even in the book, you do the same. It's like the book is about this sort of happy family, and then the accident happens at the very end. Whereas in my memory, because I read it many, many years ago, I mean, the accident is so strong that my memory of the book was, this is a book about this accident.
It started that way.
The aftermath. Whereas the aftermath is only a few pages, but it's so strong. Oh, it's such a great book. And this is why I loved so much the language of cats and dogs. But I think we have some questions here, although I don't know if I can activate them. Let me see. I'm not very good at this. Let's see. Uh-oh. Okay. So let's hear. Could Susan discuss the role of journaling in her fiction writing process? Also, how does she organize her many journals from decades of writing?
Well, as I said before, I used to number them, and I just would have one at a time. And then I probably have about 160, 170 journals now. It's insane.
Yes.
But probably, I would say in the last 15, 20 years, I will keep a separate one for this, and this will just be the poetry, or I'm just going to write, I was doing different things. So they end up doing kind of paradoxically two opposite things. And one is to save something down for if I want to use it later, maybe. Like this could be, a story idea, this could be a scene, or this is something that I'm going to write about later. Or it's like the dump deposit where I need to clear my mind. But if I had some, often there are many, many dreams. I would say there's a big chunk of all those journals that are made up of dreams, so that I can, which fascinate me. I'm not one of those people that's bored. I could listen to you tell me about your dreams all day long. So I'll write down my dreams and get rid of that. Or something important will happen to me and I'll feel like, well, in order to move on this morning to work, I'm just going to write down that thing. So it's in a way, it's capturing like all those dandelions going by, getting, putting them aside so I can clear my head.
Do you take them? I mean, do you have the journals with you at all times, or you leave them at home? And then
here's one right here. This is like small one. And I do collages on it, and it's full of. I mean, here's one. Actually, this is a very great Chekhov quote, and Chekhov's one of my favorite. My hero of the short story, I would say. And this is a quote I came across today because I was looking for another quote of his that I'd never heard before. And I think it kind of expands into kind of the usefulness of literature, in this day and age when we've got a lot of practical problems that the world is facing. And he says, man will become better when you show him what he is like. And that's what he does in his stories. He shows how flawed, how heroic, how confused, how misinformed. And once you sort of see the truth of that, then it's like a good step on your way to improving it. So that's a practical version.
Yeah. So another question, can you talk a little about your love of cinema and how that has influenced you?
Yes, the love of cinema can be I love literature, but if it's the thing you're doing, you don't, you have more of a, more thoughts going on, whereas cinema, you kind of surrender to it in a way. I used to, when I was first in New York and going to graduate school or working in the restaurant, I would go to like the double features in the old movie houses and the old movies, new movie, foreign movies, everything. And it was just a way to kind of, I'd say, still my mind, but while gathering things. I mean, there are so many things I know about the world that I would have no idea about if, it was
not been the movie
cinema. Yeah.
Well, you and I met because of a film
We met because of Stealing Beauty, and when I was working with Bertolucci, who was a great friend of yours. Yeah, that's how we met. So that was like, oh, well, cinema and movies, that's not something you really do. Like, you can at least write on your own. So when I met Bernardo and had a chance to sort of work on an idea of his with him and make it into a story, it was really one of the more kind of dazzling moments in my life, I have to say. Really exciting. And being on a film set, everyone said, oh, it's so boring. You just sit there all day. I was in heaven.
Also, you were in Tuscany, in one of the most beautiful parts of Tuscany.
That's true.
It was not a boring set, that's for sure. Listen, I think we should close. It's about, we've been talking for almost an hour. And
You've been so nice. Thank you, Francesca.
Well, thank you, Susan, for writing such a beautiful book. Oh, here's Christina.
So I want to thank you both for an amazing conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Susan, just to say, I have a book of poetry by you called Poems 4 a.m.
Yep.
And I love that little book.
Oh, thank you. I always love when people, that's like the forgotten child.
I return to it a lot, at 4, 5 a.m., that kind of. So thank you.
There may be more where that's coming from. I probably have. You can't imagine how many notebooks full of.
Good. It's been fascinating listening to you both. I wish we could go on and on. Seriously. So thank you very much for joining us, for being here in our little virtual bookshop at Books and Books. And to all of our viewers, thank you for joining us. Remember that you can order both of the books on the link below, and we hope you'll do so. We intend to sell lots and lots of copies. And then we're going to come back and we're going to interview Francesca about her book at some point, okay?
Yeah,
all right. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Good night, everyone.